So thanks everybody, and thank you for inviting me to come. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for the acknowledgement you did at the beginning. I actually live on Diru land up in far north Queensland, I think it's incredibly important that we know who has been here before us. I also like to acknowledge all the lesbians and feminists who've gone ahead of us. So today I'm talking about three key terms in my book, Vortex. So what's a vortex? Well, a vortex in an environmental sense is a mass of air or water that spins around very fast and pulls objects into its empty centre. So think of a cyclone, think of a tornado. In a literary sense, and I didn't know it had a literary meaning when I started, it's a dangerous or bad situation in which you become more and more involved and from which you cannot escape. That sounds like a definition of patriarchy. So the vortex is a kind of key theme that I keep coming back to. It's the emptiness at the centre of patriarchy. Now, Cassandra is a fascinating figure from ancient Greek history, mythology. Cassandra was, and I'm sorry, I'm moving from paper to paper. I had a computer crash on Tuesday, so I've got bits of paper everywhere. Cassandra was the daughter of King Priam. When she was a child, King Priam was the king of Troy. Troy was a matrilineal society. When she was a child, the god Apollo decided that she should be able to prophesy, and he sent a snake to lick out her ears. So that meant that she would be able to prophesy. But when the Trojan War was on, the god Apollo then decided he wanted to have sex with her. He wanted to rape her. She said no. So at that point, he said, well, you can keep prophesying, but nobody will believe you. So how does that sound after this week in politics?
Yes.
Me too. I mean, it's everything that we've been listening to over the last few weeks, if not for, well, many years actually. And we have known since I was involved in the Rape Crisis Centre in Melbourne in 1974 that most of the men who rape women are known to them, not strangers on the street. Now, the Trojan Horse is another concept. What happened with the Trojan Horse was that the Greeks had been fighting this war against Troy for 10 long years. The reason they were there was that Menelaus's wife, who was a Spartan princess, Helen, she ran off with Paris. Now, if I were Helen, I would run away from Menelaus too. He was very boring and whatever kind of man. Anyway, so she goes off with Paris, and then the Greeks, that's Agamemnon, and who's the brother of Menelaus. You actually need a bit of a chart here to follow these things. But anyway, Agamemnon is married to Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra is Helen's sister. They were Spartan princesses. Anyway, so Agamemnon decides he's going to lead this army of Greeks against the Trojans because they need to get Helen back. Probably, I suspect, because Helen is part of the land in Sparta and Menelaus doesn't have a piece of land to stand on without her. Anyway, so they go off and they fight, and on the way Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia in order to get winds that will blow them there. So he's already committed a crime. They've had this war going for 10 years. They're not doing very well, the Greeks. Odysseus, who's a smart ass, decides that they will build this horse and they'll make it as an offering to the Trojans. So they build this great wooden horse and they wheel it up outside the walls of Troy. They haven't been able to get over the walls of Troy for 10 years. Anyway, they park it outside the main gates, and at that moment all the Greek ships disappear. So the Trojans think that they're leaving. Yeah, it's a reasonable sort. But Cassandra is saying, don't do it, don't open the gates. But of course, nobody believes her. So they open the gates, and inside the Trojan Horse, that's filled with soldiers, and Odysseus is there as well. And so once the darkness comes, and they come out of the horse, they burn the city, they ravage it, they rape women, they kill men, etc., etc. So Troy falls. Troy, which was a real outpost of matrilineal society, is down. So I use this as a metaphor for how patriarchy operates. So there are a lot of promises given by patriarchy, but they are fake, they are false, they are wrong, they are dressed up as something else, they are wheeled in through the walls, and then you have the Trojan Horse. So there are 3 chapters in my book that I want to talk about in terms of how this works. The first is the one called Feminist Cassandras, Men's Patriotic Wars Against Women's Intimate Lives. So in this chapter, I talk a lot about the purpose of rape, the purpose of militarisation, and a whole lot of things to do with women's bodies, women's sexuality, the way in which prostitution is put forward as a choice, as a job, as work. That's why it's called sex work. But if you hear anybody say sex work, you know already that you need to talk to them. That the abolition of prostitution is one of the key things that we need to be able to do. And you know, it really is. It's all the women who've said no and for whom it hasn't mattered. So I think that that's an incredibly important part of what we have to do. Is the total emptiness at the centre of this kind of ideology. And women who have escaped the sex industry will say that. And so that's that part of it. Another chapter is chapter 6, which is about colonisation, erasure, and torture on the wars against lesbians. Now, not too many people actually talk about, in talking about political philosophy, political economy, globalisation and the like, there's very little out there on this subject. But I spent 15 odd years, and I'm still at it, but that was 3 years ago, researching what happens when lesbians are tortured, which lesbians are tortured, how they are tortured. And it's not a fun space to inhabit. However, I think it's terribly important. And through that, I got to know a woman called Consuelo Rivera Fuentes. And she is from Chile originally. She was tortured under the Pinochet regime in Chile in 1976. In 2001, she co-wrote an article with her partner, Linda Burke, which is called Talking With in Pain, Reflections of Bodies Under Torture. And she writes about that experience, and she knows that the reason why she was tortured was because she was a lesbian. It wasn't just she was just some woman who was pulled off the street for doing left-wing activities. They intentionally pulled her off and tortured her. And in the question that she raises is, where is my I? Where is my lesbian I? And she says, I am terrified that my body will betray me. So as a kind of summary of what happens to lesbians are tortured, this is what I have to say. The prisoner of torture is considered out of control. The lesbian is considered out of control. The tortured lesbian is therefore doubly out of control. And since she's so clearly out of control, anything that happens to her is her fault. Because if she chose to behave differently, she wouldn't be tortured. And a wonderful woman called Elaine Scarry writes about this. The Body in Pain is her book. Every weapon has two ends. In converting the other person's pain into his own power, the torturer experiences the entire occurrence exclusively from the non-vulnerable end of the weapon. That is, he has no responsibility. He doesn't even notice, a bit like Christian Porter. The next chapter is number 7, Breaking the Spirit of the Women's Liberation Movement, the War Against Biology. Now, surprise, surprise, this is my chapter about trans. I was really shocked when I was doing the research on trans, because I knew it was a bad thing. I'd been in the women's circus in 2000 when a trans guy decided he wanted to join, and I wrote against it and I spoke against it, and I was pushed out, and I know punishment comes to those who speak up. And in circus I was both an aerialist and an acrobat. There are things called breast holds, Can you imagine doing that with a trans? No. You have to trust the woman you're doing it with too. Or there are balances where you stick your head in between the legs of somebody. I'm not going to do that if I don't know the other person is a woman. But what was worse was discovering the stuff that Jennifer Bilek, Jodie Raphael, and the wonderfully named pseudonym have written about. And what they discover is that the money, the enormous amount of money that is coming to the trans, is being put in by billionaires. And guess what? Billionaires are men. And the number of the amount of money is really quite scary. And if you want to see a recent thing that's been put out, is Jennifer Bilek's fabulous map about the Pritzker family and how far they spread across the US and what they're connected to, the amount of money and so forth. I mean, when I did I have a series of sub-things called money in each chapter, and when I got to the lesbian chapter I thought, what do I do here? We don't have money. We don't have funding. There are organisations that are run on the smell of an oily rag, but there is not money. Whereas when I was writing the chapter on prostitution and the chapter on trans, it was really clear. There were pots and pots and pots of money. And let me just tell you some of the names that you should recognise if you want to know about this. George Soros runs the Open Society Foundations. He gives a lot of money to pro-sex work organisations, but also a lot of money to trans. He's associated with the Human Rights Foundation, Planned Parenthood, watch out for what they do, and many others. John Stryker, he owns a medical corporation, so any money that is put into operations, drugs, medical equipment of any kind, he is making a profit. Then there's the Pritzker family. The Colonel Jennifer Pritzker, who I call James Jennifer, because that was his name. He's the owner of the Hyatt hotel chains, runs the Tawani Foundation. His brother, or I'm actually keep forgetting whether he's brother or his cousin, might be his cousin, J.B. Pritzker. He's the governor of the state of Illinois, and he's a one of those big money people, gives investment banker, etc., gives out heaps and heaps of money. Jennifer is the richest transgender person on the planet. So there's Jennifer and then there's JB. And Jennifer claims to be a lesbian. He transitioned in 2013. Penny Pritzker is a cousin of Jennifer. Penny was part of the Obama administration. And so that's why when Biden came in just recently, it was no surprise that the Equality Act was one of the first things that he spoke about. Then there's Peter Buffett. Peter Buffett is the son of Warren Buffett and Susan Buffett. He runs something called the Novo Foundation. The Buffetts have committed absolutely billions of dollars to Novo, and they work in partnership with the Arcus Foundation. So the amount of money is really quite terrifying. You know, you and I we couldn't imagine having even a fragment of what's going on. So for me, I think the important thing was just learning about that and learning about the details. And then there are a whole lot of other people, like there's Martine Rothblatt, who's a really evil man, I think. And he's been part of the Yogyakarta principles, putting them together. He's now doing transhuman stuff. And I mean, look him up, look up Martine Rothblatt and watch the video. He has a torso-less woman, a head, who speaks and answers questions. It is the ultimate in dissociation. It is truly awful. And what Jennifer Bilek says is this is all part of disconnecting from the body, turning the human body into nothing. It really reminds me of, there's another group called the what are they? I've got it in my book now, I can't remember it. Eco something or others. And they are basically technological, they're all on about technology and cities and all of that, and it's absolute garbage. And the other thing is that it reminds me, I was reading Hannah Arendt's book last year called the Origins of Totalitarianism. And I kept finding these sentences in there that really described what's going on in terms of transgender ideology. Is really, really similar. There's this thing of denial and being able to accept this truth this day and this truth the next, and not worry about it. Sounds like Judith Butler. But another thing is that, you know, the kids who are being told that, you know, they're not really who they are and they're born in the wrong body and all the rest, I mean, they are also not only having their future stolen, they are also having their past stolen. Because if you have grown up as a boy and then you are a trans woman, you can't talk about your childhood in quite the same way, you know, because you had friends who were boys and you knocked around with a football or a soccer ball or whatever. So you get to dissociate from your own history, and the same for girls. They can't talk about themselves in quite the same way, except perhaps with other detransitioners, and there are more and more detransitioners around. So it's like in Argentina and Chile, when children were disappeared, and then they turn up in another family, perhaps part of a military family, but they've been the children of protesters and dissidents. So what do? There's a big contradiction there. It is really similar. The stolen generation, the same sort of stuff. So there's this awful trauma, dissociation, and there's also shame. And I think shame is something that many women experience, and it's an emotion of the powerless because they can't change the rules. I mean, children feel shame because the adults around them won't let them get away with things. But a lot of women feel shame, a lot of people from oppressed groups feel significant shame. So I was going to talk about how it's been moved into government, but Cass, you covered all that beautifully. I certainly don't need to, and I don't know quite the detail that you know. But I'm very pleased to see that In Australia, the fight is starting. I mean, it has already been happening, certainly in the UK, and there are women in the US who are fighting. There are women in the EU, but I think it's going to really take over the EU massively. But the other thing is just like, I read last week an article in which the woman writing it, and I'm sorry I can't remember who she was, she said the number of trans people in Australia is 0.005%. Now that's tiny. It's, imagine a 0.5% in this room versus 52% of the population. So what is wrong with the thinking of people in government, of the neoliberal feminists, of the neoliberal believers, of left men, of right men, of the whole range of other political positions? I mean, radical feminists are very, very clear about our analysis, and it doesn't seem very difficult to me. It's a really stark thing, and I'll just finish with one thing here, which is a kind of process that happens, especially from the right, but not just from the right, whoever is the powerful. It goes through a process of appropriation, well, but that's really obvious, incorporation, so instead of using the LGB acronym, adding T, I, Q, A, P plus, and the I's are definitely against the T's. Then there is commodification, so transitioning to transgender is a lucrative money earner for medical, pharmaceutical and psychological services, and you will find all the billionaires behind them. Distortion, so it's not only lucrative, it's marketed as an end game, in which the transgenders are bound to be more popular than the L, G and the B. A kid comes out as a lesbian, comes out as trans at school, suddenly she's really popular. Last week, oh no, I don't want to know you. Homogenisation. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the transgender flag, but it is pink, nursery blue and white, and like that's just like going back, and now they've also got brown and black, as if this makes them all fine. And then there's dislocation. So the young gay and lesbian people are shifted out of their communities into a new social form so that their historical lives are erased. So I'll really just finish up with that, I think, and thank you very much.